Welcome, everyone, or welcome back. If you've already joined us earlier this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is of day for you all. Welcome to Reading for Pleasure, Sexuality, Morality, and the Erotic Literature of Anne Lister. So if you're familiar with Anne Lister, you're probably very aware that she was an avid reader, which might actually be an understatement. A quick peek into the Anne Lister's Bookshelf Project Unpacked with Potential reveals literary interests that span over 852 recorded texts thus far in at least 8 different languages, from philosophy and classical literature to travel guides and gardening tips. Her collection truly reflects a mind that was as curious as it was self-reflective. Her engagement with works by authors like Marshall, Rousseau, and the Marquis de Sade wasn't just about entertainment, though. It was a way of interpreting the world, connecting with others, and at times even legitimizing her own experiences. So today, we're fortunate to have 3 brilliant speakers with us to guide us through this topic. Dr. Deborah Kamen, professor of classics at the University of Washington, whose research delves into gender, sexuality, and the role of slavery in the ancient world. Jann Kraus, historian and lecturer at Zurich University of Applied Sciences, whose PhD work focuses on queerness and kinship in Anne Lister's self-making. And Dr. Sarah Wingrove, an interdisciplinary scholar at the University of Surrey, whose work on Anne Lister and the Lister community draws from literary studies, sociology, and histories of sexuality and gender. So for this session, each of our panelists will present insights into Lister's engagement with a particular author, followed by some discussion on how these texts influenced her, and then we'll open up for some additional audience questions, and feel free to share your thoughts in the chat as we go. Before we begin, I do want to quickly provide a warning that due to the themes of some of these texts, this session will include discussions of sexual content that may be explicit or at times disturbing, including violence or issues surrounding consent. So with that in mind, let's begin. And I'll turn it over to Deb to start us off.
All right, thank you so much, Steph. So I'd like to talk about a topic that I've been working on recently myself, and that's Anne Lister as a queer reader of Marshall. Slide. So for those of you unfamiliar with Marshall, he was a Latin poet living in the 1st century CE, and he wrote satirical epigrams, many of which have sexual content. And when I call Lister a queer reader, I'm referring not only to her gender and sexuality, but also to the fact that she read Marshall in unexpected and even subversive ways. Slide. Now, Lister's reading of Latin literature is not an entirely untouched field. A handful of scholars of 18th and 19th century British literature have explored how Lister used the classics as a way of thinking through her sexuality. But to my knowledge, no classicist has explored this question until now, and I've tried to use my own familiarity with ancient texts to explore the specific ways that Lister engages with one classical author in particular, and that's Marshall. Slide. The first mention she makes of Marshall is in May of 1820. And after reading the first canto of Byron's Don Juan, she notes in one of her excerpt books, quote, as Lord Byron observed in his Don Juan, the variorum edition of Marshall has, as it were, pointed out to notice the indecent epigrams by classing them together at the end of the volume. And this clearly piqued her interest, and after years of seeking out and comparing various editions, she was able eventually to purchase herself this very copy, the one with, quote, all the obscene epigrams collected together at the end. Now, as I mentioned, I'm interested in the ways that Lister read Marshall queerly. Slide. One of these queer ways was as fodder for her own sexual knowledge and sexual pleasure. On multiple occasions in her journal, she describes how she got excited reading Marshall's poetry. And I've listed these occasions here, marking with an X those instances where she says explicitly that reading these texts caused her to masturbate. And for reasons of time, I'll focus on just one example here. Slide. On August 10th, 1823, Lister writes that she was reading the latest issue of Retrospective Review, a literary journal focusing on early modern literature, when she came across a reference to John Donne's poem Sappho to Philinus. And this brief mention clearly intrigued her. She knew who Sappho was, but this name Philinus was unfamiliar. Slide. So, ever the diligent researcher, she looked up Philinus in John Lempriere's Bibliotheca Classica. And here she would have read that Philinus was, quote, a courtesan and an immodest woman, mentioned, among other places, in Book 7 of Marshall's epigrams. Slide. And from this, she writes, she, quote, turned to Marshall as referred. This led to my looking over all his epigrams, which led to my incurring a cross just before I went downstairs. Now, among the epigrams she would have read in Book 7 of Marshall were two invective poems about a woman, a tribad, and I can come back to this term later if you'd like, a tribad named Philinus who had sex with girls, among many other sexual practices. Now, while these portraits of Philinus were meant by Marshall to be negative, they're invective, Lister did not read them that way, or at least not only that way. There was something about Philinus that she identified with and found exciting. Interestingly, immediately after she masturbated, after reading Marshall Book 7, she turned right away to look at Rousseau's account of his own masturbation in his Confessions. And this is a use of Rousseau that I believe Jann is going to be talking about very shortly. In the meantime, slide. A second way that Lister read Marshall queerly was as a vehicle of flirtation with and even seduction of other women. And as we'll see, using Marshall in this way was a very delicate operation. So in July of 1824, Lister engaged in an extended flirtation with Miss Hodson, which culminated in Miss Hodson handing Lister a few lines of Latin to translate for her. Lister combed through her Latin texts in vain, trying to find the source of these lines. She then showed them to her old Latin tutor, Reverend Knight, who told Lister that the lines had, quote, the twang of Marshall, to which Lister, trying to preserve the appearance of modesty, replied disingenuously that she, quote, did not know much about Marshall. But as soon as she walked away, quote, oh, thought I as I went musing along, Miss Hodson is au fait at Marshall. Her knowingness does not surprise, nor yet her opinion of the ladies less elevated than that given by myself. And after she returned home, quote, looking all over Marshall till I felt much excited, she now felt sure that Miss Hodson, quote, would not refuse me anything I chose to ask. There was only one problem, however. The very thing that made Miss Hodson appealing also disqualified her as a potential match. As Lister next writes, quote, I would not choose a wife who could read Marshall. The idea of Miss Hodson's having read him seemed to shock me. I did not like her the better for her read-away innocence. Who knows what practice she has had? Marshall is enough to excite and instruct. It is the filthiest and the worst book I ever read, unfit for any, especially a woman. Now, needless to say, as often with Lister, there's a double standard here. It's fine, relatively speaking, for her to read Marshall, whereas other women should avoid him at all cost. Slide. Nonetheless, Lister wrote out her own translation of the poem and promptly sent it to Miss Hodson. And the poem in question was one in which the speaker asks another man if, with all of his many friends, he still has space to be loved. And if so, the speaker would like a spot. Now, Lister's translation, while not exactly literal, does capture the general sense of the poem with the added element of rhyming couplets. Then, in her journal, as she is pondering whether to add anything else to her letter to Miss Hodson, she uses and repurposes various other lines of Marshall, marked here in yellow on the slide. She uses and repurposes other lines of Marshall from other poems to think through the pros and cons of using Marshall to flirt with. And ultimately, she decides not to escalate the flirtation. But she does not forsake her use of Marshall altogether. In fact, just a few days later, she writes, slide, having abused Miss Hodson for reading Marshall, by way of proving no woman ought to read it, translated to Mariana a few of the epigrams to Lesbia and to his wife, and 2 or 3 more. Now, the poems in question are those in which Marshall attacks a woman he calls Lesbia, often with explicit sexual language, and another poem in which he criticizes his wife for not providing the sexual services he desires, all of which he lists in detail. Now, these poems clearly have the desired effect. As Lister says, quote, when we were both a good deal excited, we jumped into bed, leaving one candle burning. So what we see is that after flirting with, but ultimately rejecting Miss Hodson for knowing too much about Marshall and therefore too much about sex, Lister used the very same poet to excite Mariana. But it's important to note that unlike with Miss Hodson, Lister herself initiated the Marshall-based flirtation with Mariana rather than vice versa. And who initiates, I think, is probably something that's going to come up in Sarah's talk as well. Now, to put it another way, Mariana had already passed the Marshall test. She apparently couldn't read Latin at all, let alone Marshall, and that allowed Lister to safely proceed with her use of the poet as a tool for seduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb. And hello, everyone. Let's continue our journey by looking at how Lister engaged with the writings of Rousseau on the first slide. So the 18th century writer and philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the city-state of Geneva became this hugely important figure for both the Enlightenment and Romanticism, two movements that are closely linked, but they are quite different in their approaches. So one focuses on reasoning and the other one on sentiment. So his legacy is also quite complex and at times contradictory. He is remembered as this radical political thinker who considered private property the source of inequality and who formulated the idea of the social contract, claiming the will of the people is what drives and justifies the existence of power within a state, and thereby laying some of the groundwork for the French Revolution. He's also remembered for his work on pedagogy, bringing up ideas about child-centered learning, giving children freedom to discover their needs and interests. And then he's the author of this hugely successful novel, Julie, which is a retelling of the story of the famously tragic historical lovers and scholars Abélard and Héloïse from the 11th and 12th century. These two, they get married in secret, they have a son, and then they are being found out. Abélard gets castrated, they both retreat to monasteries, and Héloïse becomes this famously scholarly abbess. And their story has been retold over and over again. In Rousseau's retelling, there is this setting in an idyllic Swiss landscape. This young aristocratic Swiss woman falls in love with her tutor, but she gets married off to somebody else, dies in a preventable accident. And this novel got Rousseau so immensely famous. It turned this whole new leaf on celebrity at the time, but it also put him into this sort of tawdry, dingy corner for his liberal views on love across social barriers and putting one's conscience and one's idea to live authentically above moral judgments. There are these very different aspects of him, and then there's also the Confessions. So the Confessions are his huge autobiographical work, only published posthumously in 1782, and they are considered this foundational text for modern autobiographies. He doesn't tell this story of himself as this hero and his great deeds. He focuses on what he considers the formational aspects for his character, like childhood trauma, shameful moments of moral failure, divulging the formation of his sexual desires, and his goal is to uncover his true nature to himself and a potential readership. So it's not that surprising that these confessions and the novel Julie about Héloïse are the ones that are most relevant to Lister and that play the biggest role in the diaries. If we can go on the next slide, it just really shows with a work such in such diverse directions. It's easy to understand that his legacy is complex. He was a celebrity in literature, but he also got sent into exile because he was politically and religiously so radical at times. And female writers, like his female readership, especially female readers who also wrote, praised him on one hand for depicting marriage based on respect and mutual sentiment in Julie, but also condemned him for claiming essential differences in educational needs and cognitive and emotional abilities based on sex in his works on pedagogy. So there are very contradictory strands of reception of his work, stemming also from the fact that you're comparing novels to essays to autobiographical work, which is always a bit difficult. Some very famous readers like Mary Wollstonecraft called him out harshly. Others wrote him devoted letters, visited him where he lived. There's also a lot of research by Nicola Watson, Eric Eisner, on showing his level of celebrity as this huge new thing with these queer pilgrimages at times where we just follow the people, write to them, that sort of thing, emerging at this point in time. And there's also this link we have of people like Lord Byron being big Rousseau fans, following him all over the place in France and Switzerland, and us watching Anne Lister follow Rousseau and Byron on to all these places where they worked and all the places that they wrote about. On the level of scholarship, on the other hand, we have Rousseau as this canonized and sometimes sanitized thinker in the history of big men and big events, but also as this example of deviant or sort of alternative masculinity, as we can see in a fantastic book called Rousseau in Drag that I can recommend to everyone. We're going to see some examples of that if we could go to the next slide. So that was a bit of context on the author, and let's just look at what Lister actually did with Rousseau's work. So she bought the Confessions in 1821 already, started reading them pretty much immediately, but her most intense reading periods were in 23 and 25 for the Confessions, and 25 and 26 for Julie. She usually refers to this as the Nouvelle Héloïse. Just in case you want to look it up in the index, it's easier to find that way. It stands out if you look at these instances. She's reading a lot to herself. She's reading a lot out loud to practice her French. She often takes the books with her to read out loud, especially while she's in England. She walks around reading from the Confessions. Might be less risky to do that in England than in France if you're reading French. She also uses them for translation a lot, just practicing translating back and forth just to hone her language skills. She memorizes the beginning of the Confessions later. She quotes from them. We'll see the context in a bit where she uses these quotes. And yeah, as I said, she uses the opportunity to look at the places where Rousseau worked, where the places he wrote about, but also the places he actually lived at in France and Switzerland, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. We can also find her defending Rousseau's work in mixed company, also in a sort of more public setting. These are not like one-on-one conversations usually. She says, oh, the Confessions are a work that are often misjudged, or when it turns out that another young woman is reading Julie and others are, calling that into question, saying this, reflects badly on her character. She says, it means nothing to read this. I've read this as well. So there's some kind of semi-public statement to say it's actually okay to read him, even though she knows it's a little controversial. So we're on the edge of respectability here. If we can go to the next slide. Um, if we look at the earliest quotes that Lister extracts from Rousseau, we find a passage that talks about the dangerous supplement for sexual intercourse, talking about masturbation. So Rousseau talks about masturbation as a substitute for sex. And he also, that's the next thing she writes out from his work, talks about his general skepticism of heterosexual intercourse, just like who came up with that, basically, as his comment. And so these are the first things that stick out to her that where we see, oh, she writes them down. But there are also so many other things where we don't know her reaction to what she's read. And she read these confessions over and over again, right? And if we just go and read them side by side, reading what she read and then what she also wrote about in her diaries, we can see that there are so many points of contact between them, even if she doesn't always specifically say, hey, this is something we have in common, or this is something I've been thinking about. What what happens if you actually look at the Confessions and not just at his pedagogy or his political treatises is you see Rousseau not simply as this old white man thinking about politics and states and demeaning women that he's often portrayed as, but he's also the man who fell in love with a woman he already knew the moment he saw her dressed in men's clothing. He's also somebody who expresses empathy for gay men he met in his lifetime, even when these encounters were at times predatory. During his exile, he started dressing in Armenian clothing, which was related to some of the health issues he's been having with incontinence. These health issues were linked to probably like an STI infection, also, a link to Lister's whole deal in that area. But as he dresses in this Armenian clothing, many interpret this in this othering Orientalist way as feminine. And since Rousseau had also taken up some hobbies like lace making, he says, you know, I've been called bad as a man, might as well try being a woman. So there's some kind of a cross-dressing element and just a playful stubbornness around this. They also share this big preoccupation with their sexual habits, you know, just trying to figure out where it starts, trying to figure out what it means, quantifying it, qualifying it, especially masturbation, and a general eagerness to better their lot in life, mostly through self-education. Jean-Jacques Rousseau also had a very difficult childhood where he had to learn a lot by himself. Mother died early, father would take too long to even get into that. But they have to deal with that, the social mobility part, and they are also confronted with this huge gap between their hyper visibility to the public eye on one side and then everything they have to hold back or are trying to uncover while also, you know, staying safe and put it into a context. So this gap they're trying to bridge is very similar if you read them side by side. If we can go to the next slide, we can see what exactly Lister uses Rousseau for. And compared to her other readings, as we saw just with Marshall, her usages for Rousseau are much more, in my opinion, focused inward. So she does talk to others about him, as we saw, she does defend his work, or she writes down that Mrs. Barlow had also read Julie. This is an important bit of information. But most of the notes where she mentions him are concerned with self-reflection or self-discovery in some way. Especially concerning the topic of masturbation, she draws on him. She verbalizes shame in this aspect, saying, "Oh, I just read this. I just read how he was fighting with this and this, and he's talking about this as an immature thing." Um, so there's a bit of shame coming up. We have her mentioning a connection of arousal to reading him, which does seem very natural. He talks about many erotic experiences, but unlike with other reading material, she utters doubt about whether this has anything to do with Rousseau or not. She says, "Oh yeah, it might have been him, it might have not been what I've been reading. Difficult to say." It's much clearer she draws comfort from him. She quotes his word as being immune to attacks of a mere mortal to Mariana when they both worry about being refused to rent some rooms based on thinking the landlady might maybe be a bit homophobic. So there's a real, this is basically my mantra. This is what I live by, using him for this. She uses him as an educational tool, especially for imitating his style, improving her French. She complains about reading other books in French by a female writer, and she loved this book too. She read through it like nothing, but she said, "Oh, this is ruining my French. I have to go back to Rousseau and, you know, get back to the good style of reading and writing." And finally, there's also just the big self-fashioning avowal of herself. "I know my own heart" passage. This is so central to her and knowing about her. So there's a lot about self-knowledge that is connected to Rousseau for her. If we could go to the last slide, I just say this is from the preamble from Rousseau saying what he wants to do with the Confessions. Yeah. And I'd say the most weighty erotic practice connected to Rousseau with Anne Lister is this habit of self-exploration in both senses of the word. So they're putting all these intimate, at times shameful thoughts and deeds on the page, and it's about recognizing your own character and desire through this. As with the Confessions, there are naturally layers of artifice and secrecy in this. Complete, unedited, uncensored transparency cannot be found in the memoirs. It cannot be found in a diary, especially not one that relies partially on a cipher and is not meant for publication. And still, I think there's something to this commitment to self-exploration in writing and also sexually, engaging with your own body, engaging in it despite the taboo, despite the shame, despite the danger that lies in divulging it to others. That explains the strong appeal Rousseau held for Lister, and also I think in turn the strong appeal Lister holds for us. Thank you so much for your time.
I think it's me next. So, hi everyone, and thank you, Deborah and Jann. I'm so excited to be discussing this topic with you both. So, I'm going to be rounding off this section by briefly talking about Lister's engagement with the work of the Marquis de Sade. Now, if you know anything about the Marquis de Sade, it is probably that the term sadism is derived from his name because of his reputation. Carolyn Comerford defines sadism as, quote, sexual gratification through the infliction of psychological and or physical pain, humiliation and or degradation of another individual, unquote. And this is very evident both in the behaviours exhibited by de Sade, for which he was imprisoned on multiple occasions during his life, and in his writing. So Donatien Alphonse François Marquis de Sade, 1740 to 1814, was a member of the French aristocracy, and after being transferred to the Bastille in 1784, having been convicted in 1778 for a third time for debauchery and immoderate libertinage, he began writing an early draft of the text we're discussing today, Justine. So Justine was later published anonymously in June 1791 after his release, though it would play a part in his final conviction in 1801 for immorality. And when we think about his reception, both in his own lifetime, which crossed over with Lister's, and in the last 200 years, the Marquis has retained the image of libertine most prominently. Will McMorran has suggested that, quote, as significant as Sade's influence on French intellectual life has undoubtedly been in the last 100 years, he has never entirely left behind l'atmosphère infâme des enfers des bibliothèques. He goes on to remark that Sade's broader influence in the 20th century came after his books were finally published in paperback in the 60s and 70s. He doesn't mention, however, that Sade's works were banned in France until 1957. Prior to this, surrealists including André Breton, Salvador Dali, and Man Ray were admirers of what Tony Perrottet describes as, quote, Sade's demands for complete sexual freedom and political liberty, unquote. The mid-century saw increased critical engagement with Sade, notably Simone de Beauvoir's critical essay Faut y brûler Sade, or Must We Burn Sade, in 1951, and later the first publication from Virago Press, who went on to publish Helena Whitbread's editions of Lister's journals. And this was Angela Carter's book, The Sadian Woman, from 1977. In this, we get a second-wave feminist review of Sade's writing and conception of female sexuality, though Carter herself was criticised by other writers at the time, similarly to Beauvoir 2 decades before. And from this, and I will raise this at the end, I'm curious to consider the affective part of this work that myself, Deborah, and Jann are engaging with. How do we react as researchers and as Lister enthusiasts broadly to her reception and response to Sade's work, and also Marshall and Rousseau, taking into account her own historical and cultural context and how we understand and interpret her? Are we shocked by what she says? Do we judge her? What conclusions do we draw and how? I do not want to get too ahead of myself, so I'll move to explain how Lister came to know of Sade and read his novel Justine in 1828. So the first mention of Sade appears in Lister's journal entry for the 8th of January 1828, and this is in a discussion with Isberg Thérèse de Rosny d'Adhémar, 1789 to 1872, who is more commonly referred to in Lister's journals as Madame de Rosny. In this entry, she writes, quote, the history of Madame de Rosny's interview with Napoleon, mention of his confining the Marquis de Sade for his pernicious principles. He was not to be allowed to write, but got leaves, and thus wrote another work worse than the first. Madame de Rosny has the first in 2 small volumes, read a little of it, shockingly blasphemous and obscene. Now, in this, she's referring to Justine ou les malheurs de la vertu, or Justine or the misfortunes of virtue. The amazing thing is we know exactly what edition Lister and de Rosny were reading, because after they finished reading it on the 7th of February, Lister quotes from the front pages of the book and draws in her journal the frontispiece, which was not printed in other editions. Now, this is also the first day that Lister starts reading the book, and over the next month, she reads both volumes, sometimes with Madame de Rosny, but on many occasions by herself, in part because it seems Madame de Rosny had read the book previously. And thinking back to Lister's engagement with Marshall and Rousseau, we again see this use of the text to facilitate flirting and sexual contact, though arguably in this instance, it is Madame de Rosny who is the instigator and not Lister. Slide, please. Thank you. So Lister's first response to Justine is that it was both shockingly blasphemous and obscene. What is it then that keeps her reading? Justine follows the titular character as she crosses pre-revolutionary France and experiences a myriad of trials and torture over the course of her life from the age of 12 to 26, after her parents die and her sister Juliette accepts the aid of a brothel madame. Just as an aside, Sade also wrote another novel from Juliette's perspective entitled L'Histoire de Juliette ou la prospérité du vice, or Vice Amply Rewarded. The goal of Justine throughout everything is to maintain her virtue no matter what happens, and this is presented by Sard as ironically leading to both Justine's downfall and often those she attempts to help in their own plight. Throughout her reading of Justine, Lister references some of the most explicit, sadistic, and also anti-religious scenes in the novel. On the 24th of January, Lister writes, quote, "Sat up reading about 100 pages more of de Sade, most lascivious. Finished by sitting down on an armchair and incurring a cross about 11:30. Madame de Rosny had called to beg me to go to bed, went to her, kissed and hung over her for a few minutes, and then went to my room and stood over the fireplace, reading the account of the monks and their horrible obscenity." Unquote. In this, we receive several responses of Lister's at once to the novel, but again, when thinking of uses, Lister uses this particular text to think about faith, morality, and sexuality, and how she orientates herself and her behaviour through it. While she takes sexual gratification and influence from the text, she concludes that her spiritual perspective differs from Rosny's through a conversation sparked by reading Sade's text. On the 18th of January, she records, "The book is villainous and desperately exciting every now and then. After dinner, she, Madame de Rosny, talked of religion, believes in the existence of God, but that is all, turns the Virgin, the birth and divinity of our Saviour into perfect ridicule. I laughed, told her she was pretty spirituelle and the most dangerous of women. Under other circumstances, I should be off, immediately for fear I believed she would finish by completely turning my head. I flatter her, but in my heart I pray that I may always be firm in the religion of my country. I thought of Mariana and wished her to be with me." Now, Lister's engagement with this text is limited to a brief window and does not appear with any overt significance later in her journals. Notably, she reads what is arguably a very intense book in a short period and reacts to it as she goes, as she's reading, but after she finishes Justine, she makes mention of it, in her journals at least, on only 4 other occasions. Once again to Madame de Rosny, once in a review of her year later in 1828, and then single instances with Sibella Maclean and Lady Stuart. Now here we see the dichotomy between Lister's open response to the text and her private reception and engagement with its contents. Obviously, there are additional levels to privacy and openness, and the first comes in a lie she tells to Madame de Rosny when asked whether the book affected her. She says on the 29th of January, quote, "I might have done what I liked while reading to her. I said the book was too bad, it made me cold. One word from her made me warmer than all de Sade had written. She asked me afterwards if the book had any effect on me. None, said I, but that of tranquilizing." Now, we could infer some playful teasing of Rosny in this response, of flirting, particularly as Lister was laying naked with her when the conversation commenced. However, it's also noticeable that she describes it as tranquilizing when she had in the few weeks prior, since beginning to read the novel, directly referred to it as inspiring her to masturbate on 3 separate occasions. This minimizing of her response or distancing of herself from the novel reappears when Lister discusses her reading of Justine with Sibella Maclean and Lady Stuart. In both instances, she names Madame de Rosny as taking part in the reading of the book, perhaps to indicate that she was not reading solely for her own pleasure or curiosity. Indeed, when talking to Lady Stuart in October of 1830, she frames it as, quote, "the very worst book I'd ever read," updating from her remarks on reading Marshall in 1824. She continues, Justine, "Lady Stuart asked how I had got it, and said I will tell you, it was Madame de Rosny who had it from her husband," unquote. Now, something to note is Will McMorrin's comment that, quote, as unmentionable as the name of Sade may have been in polite society at the time, the names of his characters were not subject to the same embargo, unquote. This is noticeable in Lister's journal, for when she discusses her reading of Sade with Maclean and Lady Stuart, she refers to the book's titular character, Justine, and not the text author at all. It's also pertinent to recognise how Lister's reception of Justine may have impacted her sexual interactions and her perception of their morality, both while she was reading the novel and afterwards. Engaging with Lister's journals around this time, specifically her sexual intimacies with Madame de Rosny, could be interpreted as reflecting instances of dubious consent, particularly regarding the latter's consciousness when engaged in some sexual acts. Lister also contemplates during this period the virtuousness of women, including herself, and how this might be overcome. On the 23rd, she notes that, quote, "women are curious animals with all their virtue. I believe I could, with a little painstaking, come at most of them, but surely at Madame de Rosny." Later, on the 28th, it is her own virtue she questions. Quote, "I talked of virtue, ashamed of my feelings. She, as usual, asked what I felt, what I wished for, what I wished to do. Said she had not an idea. Then, said I am glad of it, and I will never tell you," unquote. I also think there is something to be said here for an interpretation of sexual play and discovery at this point, which Lister is cautious about, and which relates to this notion of virtue, of neither she nor Madame de Rosny, quote, giving in to the other too easily and controlling themselves. She later mentions how, quote, she knows what she is about. She rather excites me, but somehow I have not taken any violent liberties as yet, unquote. Ultimately, it is unclear to us exactly what the dynamic was between Lister and Madame de Rosny, for we do not have Rosny's side of the conversation. But Sard's questioning of the merits of virtue certainly played a role in their interactions with one another. Slide, please. Thank you. Now, just to wrap up, additionally, something to think about further going forward is how Sard was framed to Lister as someone who might understand or be empathetic to her love of women. When discussing him with Madame de Rosny on the 17th of January, she records how, quote, she asked if I liked ladies better. I said yes, from little to more. Said I loved her, but thought not of harm. She said if it was the work of nature, I was not to blame. Mentioned the Marquis de Sade, who said some men were so formed they could not enjoy women. Then were they to blame to do otherwise? Anne Lister's engagement with the work of the Marquis de Sade was mostly limited to a single month, but his recognition of what she already knew of herself as natural may well have inclined her to further examine the contents of his writing and its relationship to her own notions of sexuality and morality. Thank you.
Okay. I am going to put this last slide up for just a second here before we continue on to some discussion. Our speakers have graciously shared some contact methods if you'd like to follow up with them on any of the stuff that they've discussed today. And I'm going to start off the discussion by asking a few questions that all three of you can respond to, and I'll stop sharing my slides now. So everybody talked a little bit about some of the obviously the ways that she was finding these texts, like, and who she was discussing them with, depending on, reputations of the authors or how she might come off in regards to respectability at the time. But I wanted to also talk about, Sarah mentioned, particularly with de Sade, like Lister was in France while she was reading this. And so depending on the location of where she was, or even potentially the period of her life, and who she was socializing with, do any of you have any responses in terms of how you think those factors played into her receptions of the text that you all spoke about?
I'm happy to start.
Yeah, go on.
Okay. I mean, in relation to de Sade's text, I don't think she would have likely had another chance to read it. It wasn't like widely circulated. So the fact that Rosny had a copy and was willing to share it with her and also acknowledged that she had a copy to share, I think is quite significant to her access to that text. So, because the book had already been banned in France at that point.
Does anybody want to talk a little bit more about access, especially with regard to like languages of these texts, or again, how she obtained these copies?
Yeah, it's pretty funny with Rousseau. She tries to buy it at first, and she buys a completely wrong book that's called The Confessions at first, by somebody else entirely, something French. And apparently she doesn't notice immediately. She looks at it and looks just, oh, French name must be the right thing, and notices at home. And I think she struggles to read Rousseau in the beginning because of the language, because she starts reading, but always the same pages over and over again in 21. And then I think she takes it up in earnest because she wants to go to Paris for a longer time, right? She wants to improve her French. So there's a kind of a barrier because of the language skills somehow, but it is available. It's even though there is some tawdriness, just somehow connected to Rousseau. I mean, she is also constantly on the road, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Paris. It's such a famous person, you can't ignore him. And still reading this whole thing and getting through that in the language in French is quite a barrier in itself somehow.
Yeah, and I'll add Paris comes in as well with Marshall in the sense that her first encounter is basically checking out someone else's copy of Marshall back in Halifax. But then when she goes to Paris, she spends months and even a couple of years trying to hunt down the perfect edition of Marshall, which is too expensive there, so she buys when she gets back to London.
I wanted to ask you what you think about Sarah talked a little bit about how, she's interpreting like Lister's reception of de Sade, particularly with her intimacy with Madame de Rosny. I mean, do you think her across the text that we talked about today, or some of that, similar literature, do you think her engagement with those texts was affecting how she was viewing relationships, her own sexual relationships or her own sexual identity?
I can start again.
Go on.
I do think it opened her eyes, because I mean, to do this I did read Justine, and it is a gnarly text. So if anyone wants to go and have a read over it, big warning, it is intense and it is very sexually violent. And it's about, I think the full version is about it's over 300 pages long. And she read it, was sort of reading, I mean, she was reading 100 pages in one sitting, which I think is quite an intense way to read the book. She definitely is reading this book with Madame de Rosny and then responding, to the text in their flirtations. I think they are both using it as a vehicle for flirtation. And I think it is informing her of some ways of behaving, maybe. Yeah.
I'll add on to that. So, I mean, Jann, you spoke about how reading Rousseau, like, maybe not had like a direct like influence on relationship at the time, but of course there could be. But I wanted to ask you about, Rousseau clearly had an influence on her writing. Is there anything that you wanted to share about that in terms of, like seeing some of that kind of come in during that period of time when she's reading Rousseau, or also for Deb and Sarah, like if you see any impact of, reading those other texts affecting how she's then writing?
I mean, there's been a lot of interesting writing on her as a romantic anyway, right? On her writing practices. And I think you can really see this sort of ritualizing of introspection while reading Rousseau and just getting more into this, yes, and what am I doing? And, that sort of thing. And there's also, well, linked to the question before, while it's not as much about relationships, I think the whole masturbation issue is important. I mean, we're looking at a time where there is no category like heterosexuality and homosexuality, right? But sometimes people who research this time, they say masturbation is such an identity, almost like the masturbator as some kind of a sinner, who does this perverse act. And that is something they're both so preoccupied with. So she finds a role model in that sense, but also somebody who tries to cure this affliction in some way, but by getting to know it better, by leaning into it and getting to know and understanding it. And the one scene where she talks about, oh, am I aroused by reading also? What she is reading right then are scenes from his childhood years, where with a very famous scene of when he gets spanked for the first time, quite aggressively. And around this time, he describes his arousal in the subjugation of this act, his arousal in the sensation of this, just his relationship towards women at the time. And yeah, she seems to be a bit ambivalent about what that means to her, but it's an important scene somehow, right? She reads these passages over and over again, so it is somehow personal. Like also connecting your sexuality to your experiences and what that means about you as a person, and then writing about it, it's sort of very, very tied together.
Yeah, and I'll only add that in terms of, I feel like her engagement with Marshall is not quite as deep in some ways as with Rousseau, in the sense that, she's basically kind of excerpting bits and pieces as they're relevant to her. The one instance I think where it most impacts a particular relationship is probably the episode I talked about with Miss Hudson, where they're actually using this poem about becoming, like, seeking out a friendship or maybe something more, and actually using that to precisely seek out a relationship with someone else. So there's a very clear correlation there between the content of the text itself and what's being done with it.
Speaking of Miss Hodson, I mean, it's interesting because it comes up multiple times throughout today's presentation in the journals, Lister's reaction to women who read the same kind of text that she's reading. From anything that the three of you are aware of, I mean, for certainly Madame Drosny were any other of her contemporaries kind of using this for women probably, speaking of her contemporaries, using erotic literature in the same way, where clearly with Madame Drosny, she's using it a little bit like foreplay, like they're reading it together in bed and things like that. Do we know about, at that time, like how other women were engaging with these texts?
I mean,
Probably just very well documented in the Lister's journals.
I think there seems to be the implication of this young English woman who also reads Julie that it's unsavory for her to read this. So maybe there's an implication here. I'm also thinking of, I mean, Maria Barlow says, oh yeah, I've read this too. There seems to be, oh, I know. So maybe trying to connect here, but we know that Lister sometimes likes to ignore the things she has in common with Barlow for absolutely no reason. And it also reminds me of Lister being told about Marie Antoinette as this, oh, do you know of the French queen? And just saying, oh, there is something erotic we know about women. And then she likes to, wave this away sometimes, where, especially when it's about women, like historical figures. Her literature, her classical stuff she likes to bring up, but the Marie Antoinette thing, yeah, sometimes she's just a bit dismissive of that. So I think we have a barrier of finding out what other women were actually doing at the time.
I'll ask one more question before we get to some of the audience questions here. But when you're looking at some of this, whether it's classical literature or just this time period of this is the media that Lister had accessible, right? When we think about that, like compared to contemporary, like books, films, things like that, do you see parallels of her using this media to, kind of explore and express her own sexual identity? Do you think that's part of it, is her reading it and figuring that out for herself as she's going?
As parallels in us doing this in a way. So many people have talked about reading her diaries and talking about finding themselves coming out and arousal in so many ways. So I see a parallel there. But the simplest thing would also just be sometimes health class and hearing about queer people for the first time in a sort of scientific context. Sometimes you watch the worst movies you can find just because there's something there. Or you've tried to also writing fan fiction, I think, is very much in that area. So just subversive readings of the classics in any way, I think we all know in some shape or form.
Yeah, I would agree with what Jann just said. And I think especially with Marshall, it really is sort of pretty akin to, seeking out porn. I think, especially on and as Jann said, like all these things, it can be like the worst movie ever. And I loved in Sarah's presentation that basically de Sade has replaced Marshall as the worst book ever. But it doesn't even matter if it's bad, if it's still doing something for you. Clearly in this case, she's seeking out, for a particular purpose. There's something she's relating to, but also getting excited by. I do think, with all of these texts that we're looking at, there's sort of the added element that it's not just that it's pornographic or potentially pornographic, but all these things are in different languages. And so there's a certain cachet she gets from knowing Latin and knowing French, which kind of is the layer on top of the fact that she's also getting aroused by the content of it. Like she gets to feel sort of superior by the fact that she has this knowledge of multiple languages.
I think there's also something to be said that having access to these texts kind of brings out this sort of notion of community, that there are other people who share her desires, who share in her perspective. So that through reading that, she gets to reflect on herself, which I think we think of as quite a modern thing, to be able to look back and see yourself. I think Jann was saying this earlier, that it is essentially what we're doing now. Reading, like looking back and seeing ourselves reflected, is something that she has been doing and she reflects on throughout her journal.
Okay. We do have a couple questions here. One is for Jann. When Lister read Foyer de la Femme, she masturbated afterwards, saying she did it because of reading so much about women. So the act followed the reading. Did she write, would she read Rousseau to get aroused, or did it follow like with Fourier?
Yeah, I don't really see direct connections with Rousseau and the masturbation. Well, the thinking about masturbation, of course, that's always tight, and she reads Rousseau so much in the morning and the evening that sometimes it just gets close to the incurring the cross. But the one moment she talks about it specifically, like explicitly, she says, "I don't know." Um, I felt a bit inclined in the afternoon, and that is when she, as I mentioned, read this whole around this spanking scene, but it's not specific enough for her. That is a part of the confessions where there's a lot of talk about the first crushes on women or attraction to women, but she doesn't make as much of a point of linking these things.
Okay. We have another question about whether Anne was influenced by the Roman sexual understanding as something one person does to another, and with its elaborate sexual vocabulary, although of course she invents her own elaborate vocabulary.
I'm guessing this is my question. Yeah, so I don't, this is this sort of a recent sort of post-Foucauldian understanding that we have of Roman sexuality as essentially, two actors, one acting upon the other. I don't know whether she would have understood it that way. At least the way she talks about it, it doesn't seem that she had fully the understanding that we do of the kind of the map or grid of Roman sexuality. But there is, I think she's finding the elements that, when she talks about tribadism or other types of sexuality that are that do come up in the Roman text, she takes the bits and pieces she likes. But I think she's sort of less concerned, it seems, with, let me think about more about this. Yeah, I'm not sure if she'd be able to categorize sexual acts the way we do, but there's a reason she's gravitating towards Philinus, for example, this tribad figure. There's this understanding of power dynamics that is somehow appealing.
I remember I was part of the transcription project, and I did that page for that journal entry, and it was really interesting to see just the mention of it, because it's only the title of it, in reference, somebody else is reviewing it.
Yeah,
and that's what she's
so
reading.
brief.
And it just sends her on this spiral of I need to go look up where is this? Can I find it? That kind of thing.
Exactly. And what Sarah, just to go off of that what Sarah and Jann were saying about how in a way we're reading Anne Lister's. We're reading Anne Lister and the way that she's reading other texts, and I feel like it's sort of the same thing with these rabbit holes that she goes down. I feel like when we're researching her, we're also compelled to go down these same rabbit holes.
There is this one Rousseau quote that I left out just for time, but he does say in the basically instructions on how to read the confessions, he says the whole point is all of your life you try to get to know yourself as much as possible, and if you have read these confessions, then you will have known at least one other person intimately and understood one person. And that seemed very, very meta to me.
Okay. This has been a great discussion. I don't see any other questions coming in, but I think that could also be maybe that people are a little bit more shy to ask them here and might feel more comfortable if they've got more questions with moving on into the breakout room. Just a reminder, we are coming up on our hard break in the schedule, so we'll have time now. This is a great chance to, like I said in the welcome, stand up, go stretch your legs, take a break from the screen. Although we will have the breakout room open, so if people would like to stick around and interact and talk more about that, you can definitely do so. And then we will see you back here for the next session with Searching for Anne with Diane Helford.